I've always been a woman who prefers the quiet hum of life over the deafening roar of chaos. My name is Eleanor Whitmore and I live in Maplewood, Vermont. A town so small you might miss it if you blink while driving through. It's peaceful here, surrounded by rolling hills, fields of wildflowers, and neighbors who wave hello without expecting much back. After my husband passed away 5 years ago, this little house became both my sanctuary and my prison. Don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining. I've got my books, my garden, and enough crossword puzzles to keep my mind sharp until kingdom come. But there are days when the silence feels heavier than others. My son Jonathan is a different story altogether. He's a corporate lawyer in Boston, sharp-suited, ambitious, and perpetually busy. We used to talk more often, but these days his calls are few and far between. When he does visit, it's always with an air of distracted politeness, like he's checking off a box on some invisible list. Still, I love him fiercely, even if sometimes I wonder if he sees me as just another obligation. The knock at the door startled me last Friday evening. I wasn't expecting anyone, but there he was, Jonathan, standing on my porch holding a bottle of expensive wine and a bouquet of flowers that looked like they cost more than my monthly grocery bill. "Mom," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "thought I'd stop by." We spent the evening catching up, or at least pretending to. He talked about his latest cases, his promotion, and how crazy things were at work. Meanwhile, I listened, nodding along while sipping herbal tea. It wasn't until dessert that the tension finally bubbled to the surface. "You know, Mom," he began casually, cutting into his slice of apple pie, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time you started considering other options for living arrangements." "Other options?" I nearly choked on my tea. "What do you mean?" "Well," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "you're getting older and this place, it's so isolated. What if something happened? Wouldn't it be easier for everyone if you moved into assisted living?" Easier for everyone. That phrase stuck in my throat like a bitter pill. I wanted to scream, to tell him exactly what I thought of his suggestion. But instead I smiled sweetly and said, "Unless you think I can't handle running your household for a week." His eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me." "Oh, I'm just saying," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "If you're so worried about whether I'm capable or not, why don't we put it to the test? Let me take care of your life in Boston for a week. If I fail, you win. If I succeed..." I paused for dramatic effect. "You owe me 10 grand. He laughed, thinking it was a joke. Little did he know I was dead serious. By Saturday morning, Jonathan had stopped laughing. In fact, he seemed downright annoyed. "You're really going to do this?" he asked as we packed my overnight bag. "Why not?" I shrugged. "It'll be fun. Besides, it's been ages since I've seen your fancy city life up close." Fun wasn't exactly the word I'd use once we arrived in Boston. His penthouse was sleek and modern, all glass walls and stainless steel appliances. It looked like something out of a magazine, but it felt cold, like a showroom rather than a home. As Jonathan gave me the grand tour, I couldn't help but notice how sterile everything was. No family photos, no knickknacks, no signs of life beyond perfection. "This is where you spend most of your time?" I asked, trying to mask my discomfort. "It's efficient," he replied matter-of-factly. "Efficient, yes. Inviting? Not so much." Monday morning came too quickly. Claire Harper, Jonathan's assistant, greeted me with thinly veiled skepticism. She was young, polished, and clearly intimidated by Jonathan's towering presence. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said stiffly, handing me a tablet filled with appointments and deadlines. "Mr. Whitmore says you'll be taking over today." "Thank you, dear," I replied, flashing her a warm smile. "Now let's see what we're working with." As I scrolled through the endless notifications and emails, I realized this wasn't going to be easy. But then again, nothing worth doing ever is. By lunchtime I was already knee-deep in chaos. Phones rang nonstop, clients demanded immediate attention, and Jonathan hovered nearby like a hawk waiting to swoop in and declare victory. But I refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead, I dug in my heels and got to work. Using skills honed from decades of teaching unruly teenagers, I created color-coded schedules, delegated tasks to Claire, and even managed to squeeze in a quick meditation session to calm everyone's nerves. By the end of the day, the office ran smoother than it had in months. Jonathan watched silently, his jaw clenched tight. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as he tried to figure out how I'd pulled it off. On Tuesday, Jonathan decided to throw me a curveball. He scheduled a meeting with one of his most difficult clients, a man notorious for being rude and unreasonable. "Good luck with this one, Mom," he smirked as he handed me the file. I flipped through it casually, memorizing key details before heading into the conference room. The client, Mr. Thompson, was every bit as unpleasant as promised. But instead of letting him bulldoze over me, I leaned forward and said, "Mr. Thompson, I understand your concerns completely. However, I believe we can resolve this issue quickly if we focus on solutions rather than problems." To my surprise, he softened almost immediately. By the end of the meeting, we'd reached an agreement that left both parties satisfied. As I walked out, Claire whispered, "How did you do that?" "Years of dealing with stubborn teenagers," I replied with a wink. By Wednesday, I could tell Claire was starting to warm up to me. She still had that guarded look in her eyes, like she expected me to collapse under the pressure at any moment, but there was a flicker of curiosity too. Maybe even admiration. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said one afternoon as we sorted through a mountain of paperwork, "how do you stay so calm? Most people would have cracked by now." I chuckled softly and handed her a plate of homemade oatmeal cookies I'd baked the night before. "Years of practice, dear. Plus, a little sugar never hurts." She smiled despite herself, taking a cookie. "You're really good at this." "Better than," she trailed off, glancing toward Jonathan's office. "Better than my son?" I finished for her, raising an eyebrow. Claire flushed red but didn't deny it. "He's brilliant, don't get me wrong. But sometimes, he forgets that people aren't just cogs in a machine." Her words lingered in my mind long after our conversation ended. They reminded me of something I'd suspected for years, that Jonathan's relentless pursuit of success had come at a cost. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one who felt like a burden around here. Jonathan wasn't about to let me win without a fight. On Thursday morning, he ambushed me with a stack of documents thicker than a phone book. "This needs to be reviewed and summarized by noon," he announced smugly. "Good luck." I stared at him over the rim of my reading glasses. "Is that all?" "Darling, I graded essays longer than this while drinking instant coffee and listening to toddlers scream." He rolled his eyes but didn't argue further. Still, I knew this was just the beginning. Throughout the day, he piled on more tasks: client calls, strategy meetings, and a last-minute presentation prep. Each challenge was designed to break me, to prove once and for all that I was out of my depth. But instead of crumbling, I thrived. There's something oddly satisfying about proving someone wrong, especially when they happen to be your own child. By the time the clock struck 5, I'd not only completed everything on his list but also uncovered a few glaring inefficiencies in his workflow. When I dropped the neatly organized files onto his desk, he looked genuinely shocked. "How did you?" "I'm full of surprises," I interrupted, patting his shoulder. "Don't underestimate your mother." Friday brought a new kind of challenge, one I hadn't anticipated. While organizing Jonathan's filing cabinet, because apparently no one else ever bothered, I stumbled across a folder marked confidential. Curiosity got the better of me, so I flipped it open, and immediately wished I hadn't. Inside were emails, financial statements, and contracts detailing questionable business practices. It seemed Jonathan had cut corners to secure a major deal, falsifying numbers and hiding losses from investors. My stomach churned as I read through the documents. This wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. For a moment I considered confronting him right then and there. But anger wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I tucked the folder under my arm and made a mental note to dig deeper later. That evening, as Jonathan sipped whiskey in his study, I sat quietly in the living room, staring at the fireplace. How had my son become this person? Was it ambition? Fear? Or simply the toxic environment of corporate America? Whatever the reason, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let him destroy himself, not if I could help it. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, giving me the perfect opportunity to act. I called Claire into the kitchen under the guise of needing help with breakfast. Once we were alone, I slid the confidential folder across the counter. "What's this?" she asked, frowning. "Something you should see," I replied evenly. "And someone you should call." It took her less than 10 minutes to understand the gravity of the situation. Her face went pale and she whispered, "We need to tell Judge Hargrove." Margaret Hargrove was a retired judge and one of Jonathan's former mentors, a woman known for her integrity and no-nonsense attitude. If anyone could help us navigate this mess, it was her. Together, Claire and I drafted a plan. We'd present the evidence during Monday's board meeting, forcing Jonathan to confront his mistakes publicly. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. As we worked side by side, I realized something important. I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. For the first time in years, I felt like part of a team. Sunday evening arrived with heavy clouds looming over the city. Jonathan must have sensed that something was off because he kept glancing at me suspiciously during dinner. Finally he snapped. "What are you up to, Mom?" he demanded, slamming his fork down. "You've been sneaking around all week acting like you own the place. What's your angle?" My heart ached at the accusation in his voice, but I refused to back down. "My angle? Oh, sweetheart, it's not about angles or games. It's about helping you realize what you've become." "And what exactly am I?" he shot back, his tone icy. "A man who's lost sight of who he is," I said softly. "A man who thinks success is measured by money and power instead of character and compassion." He scoffed, standing abruptly. "You don't know anything about my life." "No," I agreed, rising to meet his gaze. "But I know enough to see that you're headed down a dangerous path. And unless you change course, you'll lose everything, including yourself." With that, I walked away, leaving him standing in stunned silence. Monday morning came too quickly. As I prepared for the board meeting, my hands trembled slightly. This wasn't just about winning a bet anymore. It was about saving my son from himself. Claire and I arrived early, setting up the conference room with meticulous care. When Jonathan walked in, flanked by his usual entourage, he looked confident, as if he already knew he'd won. "Good morning, everyone," he began, launching into his usual spiel. But before he could finish, I cleared my throat loudly. "Actually, Jonathan," I interjected, standing up, "there's something you need to hear." Every eye in the room turned to me as I placed the confidential folder on the table. "These documents reveal discrepancies in your recent deals. Discrepancies that could land you in serious trouble." The room erupted into murmurs as I laid out the evidence piece by piece. Jonathan's face went white, and for the first time in years, I saw fear in his eyes. The air in the boardroom was thick with tension as I finished presenting the evidence. Jonathan sat frozen, his polished facade crumbling before my eyes. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Margaret Hargrove, Judge Hargrove as everyone called her, leaned forward, her sharp gaze pinning Jonathan where he sat. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice calm but firm, "care to explain these discrepancies?" Jonathan stammered, trying to deflect blame. This isn't accurate. Someone must have tampered with the files." I raised an eyebrow and slid a second folder across the table. Inside were copies of emails and timestamps proving the document's authenticity. "These aren't just numbers on paper, Jonathan. They're people's livelihoods. Your clients trusted you and you betrayed that trust." His face flushed red and he turned to me, his voice trembling with anger. "You set me up. You planned this whole thing." "No, son," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "You did this to yourself. I'm just giving you a chance to fix it." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Ms. Whitmore is right. The question now is whether you're willing to take responsibility, or let this destroy your career." The room fell silent again as Jonathan buried his face in his hands. For a moment I thought he might break down completely. But then he took a deep breath and looked up, his expression a mixture of shame and determination. "What do I need to do?" he asked quietly. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "First, you step away from active management temporarily. Second, you work with a mentor, me, to address these issues and rebuild your reputation. Third, you implement stricter ethical guidelines within the company. Do you accept?" He hesitated, glancing at me. I gave him a small, encouraging nod. Finally, he sighed and said, "I accept." A collective murmur of relief swept through the room. Claire, sitting beside me, squeezed my hand under the table. I felt a surge of pride. Not because I'd won, but because Jonathan had chosen to fight for redemption instead of running from the truth. After the meeting, Margaret pulled me aside. "That was quite the performance, Eleanor," she said with a wry smile. "Though I suspect it wasn't entirely about teaching your son a lesson." I chuckled softly. "Let's just say I wanted to remind him and myself that family comes first. Winning the bet was just frosting on the cake." She nodded knowingly. "Well, consider the scandal contained. I'll ensure the board handles this discreetly, provided Jonathan follows through on his commitments. Thank you, I said sincerely. For everything. As we parted ways, I couldn't help but feel a weight lifting off my shoulders. The battle was far from over, but at least Jonathan had taken the first step toward becoming the man I knew he could be. By Tuesday afternoon, I was packing my bags to return to Maplewood. Jonathan walked me to the door looking more subdued than I'd ever seen him. I'm sorry, Mom, he said quietly. For everything. I stopped folding a sweater and turned to face him. Apologies are nice, sweetheart, but actions matter more. Prove to me and to yourself that you mean it. He nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. I will. I promise. Before I could respond, Claire appeared with a small potted plant in her hands. For your garden, she said shyly. It's lavender. Thought it might remind you of us. Tears pricked my eyes as I accepted the gift. Thank you, dear. It's perfect. As I stepped into the taxi, I glanced back one last time. Jonathan stood there, watching me leave with an unreadable expression on his face. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful about our future together. Back in Maplewood, life returned to its quiet rhythm. I spent my days tending to the garden, reading by the fire, and reflecting on the whirlwind week I'd just endured. The silence no longer felt oppressive. Instead, it was comforting, a reminder that even storms eventually pass. Still, there were moments when loneliness crept in. I missed the hustle and bustle of Boston, the camaraderie I'd shared with Claire, and yes, even the infuriating stubbornness of my son. But most of all, I wondered if Jonathan would truly change, or if old habits would pull him back into the same destructive patterns. One crisp Saturday morning, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside my house. Curious, I opened the door to find Jonathan standing on my porch, with Claire and Judge Hargrove in tow. We thought it was time for a visit, Jonathan said sheepishly, holding up a bag of groceries. And maybe a cooking lesson? I laughed despite myself, ushering them inside. Over the weekend, we cooked meals together, took long walks through the countryside, and shared stories around the fireplace. For the first time in years, I saw glimpses of the boy Jonathan used to be, the one who loved climbing trees and asking endless questions about the stars. Claire fit right in, laughing at Jonathan's clumsy attempts to knead dough and marveling at the beauty of Vermont. Even Margaret seemed charmed by the simplicity of country life. By Sunday evening, I realized something miraculous had happened. We'd become a family again. On Monday morning, Claire lingered behind after breakfast, helping me water the plants in the garden. Mrs. Whitmore, she began hesitantly, I wanted to thank you for everything. For what, dear? I asked, genuinely curious. For showing me that it's okay to stand up for what's right. After seeing how you handled things with Jonathan, I decided to leave the firm. I'm going back to school to study environmental law. My heart swelled with pride. Oh, Claire, that's wonderful. You'll make such a difference. She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. You already have. Over the next few months, Jonathan kept his promises. He worked closely with Margaret, implementing new ethical standards at the firm and earning back the trust of his clients. He also started visiting Maplewood regularly, bringing little gifts and updates on his progress. You know, Mom, he said during one of his visits, I think I finally understand why you pushed me so hard. It wasn't about proving anything, it was about making sure I didn't lose myself. I reached out and squeezed his hand. Sometimes, Jonathan, the hardest lessons are the ones we need the most. Life settled into a comfortable routine. My garden flourished, thanks in part to Jonathan's newfound appreciation for manual labor. Claire sent regular letters updating me on her studies, and Margaret occasionally dropped by for tea and lively debates about politics. For the first time in years, I felt truly content. The scars of the past hadn't disappeared, but they were healing, and that was enough. Months later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Jonathan, written in his neat, precise handwriting. Dear Mom, I don't say this often enough, but I love you. Thank you for believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Because of you, I've learned that success isn't measured by titles or bank accounts but by the lives we touch and the integrity we uphold. I hope I can make you proud every day. Love always, Jonathan. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter and tucked it into my journal. Later that evening, I sat by the fireplace, rereading Jonathan's words. Beside me lay the check for $10,000, the winnings from our bet. With a satisfied smile, I tore it into tiny pieces and tossed them into the flames. The money had never been the point. What mattered was the bond we'd rebuilt and the lessons we'd both learned along the way. As spring arrived, I planted the lavender Claire had given me alongside a row of tulips. Watching the earth nourish new life reminded me of something profound. Growth requires patience, care, and sometimes a little pruning. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over my garden, I whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, for second chances, for forgiveness, and for the unbreakable ties of family.